Long Island gospel sound. You know what's going down. Long Island gospel sound. You know what's going down. Long Island gospel sound. You know what's going down. Long Island gospel sound. You know what's going down. Long Island sound. Long Island sound. Yeah. Long Island sound. Got it going on. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Lockie, and I'm joined today with Bishop Norman Lyons II, the pastor of the Fountain of Life Church, which is located in Uniondale. Thank you, Bishop, for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, Bishop, when did you accept your calling into the ministry?
1978 is when I accepted my calling, and I started preaching January 27th, 1979.
Got the dates and everything. So, for those of us who can't do math that quickly, how long have you been preaching and pastoring?
I've been pastoring for 40 years, and I've been preaching for 44 years.
Wonderful. So, as someone who is very heavily educated, as stated in your bio, what has been your greatest challenge in ministry?
The greatest challenge that I have faced in ministry is the loneliness factor, because the isolation of the elevations puts you in a position where you have to be very careful who you talk to.
Absolutely.
So in the interim periods of time when I was developing relationships with my mentors, it was extremely lonely, and I had to get used to that level of isolation.
Is it something that you still struggle with today, or are you kind of content with that level of loneliness? Is there a longing for a deeper connection?
That's a very good question, because along the way in my journey, I was very blessed of God to have strong mentors. And I was mentored by bishops and their wives.
Wow.
They mentored my wife and I, and believe it or not, their children mentored my children. So initially it was extremely lonely, but as I began to develop and travel, the Lord gave me mentors. I remember when we moved to our first rental location in Hempstead, the Lord said to me that I would have to travel to get my role models, and that's exactly what happened.
You've been all over the world. What has been the most impactful mission trip for you?
It would have to be the first one, because as I stated, I preached my first sermon in January of 1979.
Correct.
That summer was my first missionary trip.
Wow.
I didn't realize it at the time, but that was highly unusual. I didn't realize how inexperienced I was. And so the first summer after I started preaching to go to Haiti, of all places, it was an extreme experience. However, my mother formed a 24-hour prayer chain. So every hour of the day, somebody was praying for me.
Amen.
And Haiti at that time was very inundated with witchcraft. And so it was a daily spiritual battle. And I was blessed of God never to get sick. My first 3 weeks there, they didn't allow me to preach. I was remanded to manual labor. They put me on top of a rock pile, and I had to bust rocks, and I had to mix the residue to make cement, and then I was pouring cement into the foundation of the church. And after the missionaries that came with a lot of money finished their tour, then they let the young man preach. And so my second half of my stay there, I started to preach, and the Lord blessed us with signs and miracles. And then they wanted me to stay.
How about that?
Yeah, they wanted me to stay then. I almost couldn't get out. But I came home, and I learned a lot, and it exposed me to abject poverty, and it exposed me to what ministry is really all about. It was the closest experience that I had to what I read about in the New Testament.
Wow. Wow.
So I cherish it to this day.
That's amazing. That is incredible. So, leisurely, what has been your favorite place to travel?
Leisurely?
Leisurely. Do you get leisure travel?
Yes.
You do? Okay.
I learned the hard way. That is just a necessity, is just as important as labor.
Absolutely.
You have to rest. And I struggled with that at first. In the culture that I grew up in, I was judged by productivity out of necessity. So it was very difficult for me to rest. But I learned the hard way how to rest. And I went to a little obscure hamlet called Sanford, North Carolina. That was the place that gave me solitude. And eventually, my wife and I, we rented an apartment there. And I liked it so much, I signed a better lease for a larger apartment in a very nice development. And I developed to the point where I spent 1 week out of the month there. But at that time, I was doing a lot of traveling. And the reason why I chose Sanford was because my chief apostle for now over 40 years resided there. So my wife knew where I was, and I was able to spend. Yes, I spent quality time with my apostle and his wife.
Wonderful. North Carolina, who'd have thunk it? You've been all over the world.
Yes.
And North Carolina is
It
your
did it
leisure
for me.
place. That's good for you, though. I love that. So what are your greatest assets?
Outside of all of the agencies of the Bible and the gifts of the Spirit and the fruit of the Spirit, without hesitation, it's my wife, Sharon Elaine. She is my greatest asset.
Y'all, a man in love. Love to see it. Let's see what else we have here. Let me do something off here. So, besides Jesus, who is someone that you most want to emulate in the Bible?
In the Bible?
In the Bible.
Jeremiah.
Why?
Jeremiah, he served for 40 years. And basically, his word was dishonored. He was one of the most misunderstood prophets in the Bible, but he was the most loyal. He wasn't popular, but he was loyal to God. He was consistent, and it didn't matter how he was received in contemporary history. His loyalty was to God, and he was a real prophet. But the people didn't listen to him. And it was interesting, Dr. Wiersbe explained how even though that was the prevalent, obvious experience as it was outlined in the Old Testament, Dr. Wiersbe said the New Testament vindicated Jeremiah.
Absolutely.
Because when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" one of the men that they mentioned was Jeremiah. So to be considered to be like Jesus was his vindication. And I was always inspired by the fact he was the most misunderstood prophet, the most obscure prophet, difficult to understand, but he was loyal to God, and he didn't let the lack of current popularity dissuade him. And that's why I liked him. He's my premier biblical character.
That's amazing. I knew about Jeremiah, but I've never even viewed it from that standpoint. So thank you for enlightening me on that. What do you plan to accomplish in the future?
In the future, my goal is to redefine our current church. As I stated, we have been in existence 40 years. I have served 3 generations: the traditionalists, my generation, the baby boomers, and now the millennials. But my challenge now is to remain relevant to the upcoming generations long enough to turn our church around, and this is what I mean. As a typical African American church in a urban type setting, we are a celebratory church.
Absolutely.
But now I want to make the transition. My job as the founding pastor is to build a bridge from being a celebratory church to being a service-orientated church, a church now of servitude. The 3 points of our vision is to worship, to witness, and to work. We got the worship down, but now we got to work on the witness and the work. And so I have targeted the senior citizen community immediately in the vicinity of our church there around the corner. And our goal, starting in the fall of this year, is to adopt them to make sure that in that senior citizen facility, there is no food insecurity. I've already negotiated with the farmers in the area in which I live. They have agreed to allow me to purchase fruit and produce at a wholesale price. We're going to bring that fruit, package it, and distribute it to the residents of that facility. And we believed God for a $6,000 stove, and he gave it to us.
Got the stove.
And he gave it to us as a gift from a developer.
Wow.
And we're going to use that stove to prepare meals. In addition to the distribution of fruit and vegetables, we're going to prepare meals systematically and consistently for those senior citizens. And that's going to be the first aspect of the turnaround and the transition from celebratory to servitude. And we want to extend our servitude to redevelop some programs we used to have. We used to have a teenage mother ministry. And one of my friends suggested that we make it a teenage mother-father program. So we not only minister to the teenage sisters, but their brothers and the fathers of the children. We want to reinstitute our summer academy to bring the kids into church for the whole summer. And we teach them the Bible. And we also make sure that we enhance their education. We augment their education during the summer so that they go back better than they came.
Yeah.
And there's some other things that we intend to do, but we definitely want to focus on the senior citizens and the young people in the immediate area of Uniondale.
Absolutely. I love that. So, would you mind elaborating on what it's like trying to bridge this gap between the baby boomers or the people of generations past and the generations now? Because there seems to be some sort of disconnect, because as far as I can see, a lot of young people or people my age are distancing themselves from church, not from God, but from church. What can pastors do or leaders do to kind of bridge the disconnect that people are having between the four walls of the church and this next generation?
That's another great question. And I wrestle with that. And in my particular wrestling match, I had to admit to myself that I needed to shed my ministry concepts that work so well, but they worked well in the past. I am a baby boomer, but I was trained for ministry by traditionalists. So I was trained to get along with my seniors. So I was able to pastor them because I was trained by traditionalists. Right. I knew what they expected. And I was a little old-fashioned myself. And then, of course, I identified with my own generation.
Right.
But now, when I have to deal with the millennials, I depended upon my fathering skills because I fathered two millennials. But I realize now the paradigm has shifted.
Yeah.
So now I have to begin to identify with Generation X and the rest of the generations.
Yes.
So what I had to do was admit that what worked in the past was good, but I had to shed a lot of my idiosyncrasies and begin to prepare myself. So I went back to school.
Wow.
And I'm currently a student at Oral Roberts University, and I am retooling myself to use the modern technology, and I'm doing a lot of listening to my two daughters and the young people in the church. I spend more time listening to them just to find out what it is like. And I ask them, so tell me, what is it like being you after the benediction? What is it like on Monday for you? What is it like during the week? How are they treating you on your job? And the feedback is educating me as to what I should begin to deal with in my preaching, in my teaching, and preparing myself in my counseling. So I'm still in that major transition, but I think the greatest challenge is to admit that you have to change.
Yeah.
And if you don't, the penalty is that you will become irrelevant very fast. And I refuse to be irrelevant.
I know that's right. So what has this journey in your 40 years of pastoring and being a father, what has this taught you about yourself?
Let me begin with the father component. I was raised in a single parent household. And I can remember very vividly, I was laying in my bed in my room, looking up in the ceiling. And I decided the two things that I wanted to accomplish. Now, they're going to sound a little awkward. But after pondering, I said, the two things that I want to accomplish in life is that I want to be a good father and I want to be a homeowner. So, of course, in school, when they went around the horn and they asked kids what they wanted to be, when I said that was strange. But it was important to me because of my life experience.
Right.
So when the Lord blessed me with a wonderful, exceptional wife, we had two daughters. And I focused on that with intensity because I wanted to make sure that I was never that preacher that was a great preacher but a crummy creature.
Ooh.
I wanted to have a relationship with my daughters. I wanted them to know who their father was. I wanted them to know my mistakes. I wanted them to know my journey. I wanted them to know that I would give my life for them. And that even though I have a public ministry, they will always be premier in my life and in my heart. And so my wife and I, we dove into it. And I found out in my reading, Dr. Frank Pittman said, the process of fathering is what makes you a man. So fathering revolutionized my manhood and my ministry. And if, as a man now, if you can be a good father, you can be a good pastor. As a woman, if you can be a good mother, you can be a good pastor. So that was the mental matrix that I formed and I lived by. That was like my credo. And so it was very important to me. And so that was integrated into my ministry. So wherever I went, my whole family had to go. I had to be in an environment where I could take my wife and my two daughters. So it helped me, and I don't regret it. And so that's the fathering component. And with the ministry, pastoring was one of the greatest things that happened to me because it decimated my pride. It obliterated my pride. When I grew up, the competitive environment that I grew up in, you had to be aggressive, and it was expressed through sports. And there was a period in my life, I didn't talk about it, but I felt absolutely invincible. That's why I love Bishop Owen Kelly. He was the titular leader of the organization that I was in when I started preaching. He was the jurisdictional bishop. He knocked that pride out of me in one service.
How'd he do it?
He critiqued my sermon publicly.
Oof, that'll do it.
And it wasn't a good critique. It was actually a rebuke. And he said, preaching like that, son, you'll never be ordained in this church. And although there's a lot of debate as to whether he should have done it or not, but deep inside I knew he was busting up that pride in me. And that's the day I was really made in terms of being able to accept the power of submission to a tutor to help make me. And that was one thing. But then when I started pastoring, it humiliated me because I had to really accept, wow, all that I know, all that I have seen, everywhere I have been, it means nothing when it comes to facing the monumental task of pastoring people.
Yeah.
And I had to literally just change my theology. And so I had to spend prolonged periods with God alone. I would go to Manhattan to my wife's former apartment, and her parents were so gracious they would allow me to shut in there. And she knew where I was. I would shut in with God in my wife's old room.
Wow.
And I would spend protracted periods of time alone with the Lord, praying and reading, because pastoring rendered me helpless. And I had to rely on God like nothing else in my life made me do. So really, I had to die to Norman. I had to be broken. And I realized that in every stage that I experienced as a pastor, I had to endure another level of brokenness.
Yeah.
Because the higher you go in God, the less of you can take the journey. So I was constantly being crucified and resurrected. And then there comes a point where you accept it. One philosopher said, in the instant that you accept your suffering, you transcend it. The pain is not extracted, but it no longer matters.
Yeah.
Because you accept this is an integral part of life. So the pain was transferred into power, and I was able to master what could be mastered. Beecher Hicks Jr. said something in a book that I wish I had heard when I first started. He said, you never master pastoring. Pastoring masters you. For me, I experienced the validity of that word in this regard. Sis, everything I said I would never do if I became a pastor, I did it.
Wow.
In my observations as an itinerant preacher, as an evangelist, and you are preaching for pastors and running revivals, and you look at them and you're critiquing them and said, I'm never going to do that. I'm never going to do that. Oh, I'm not going to do that. Every single solitary thing I declared I was not going to do, I was humiliated to the point to do it.
Wow.
And that's pastoring.
True.
Because you have to decide whether it's going to be about you or it's going to be about God and the work. And if you're going to follow Jesus, there's no way out, because he took it all the way to the cross.
Absolutely. It's amazing. So one last question. What advice would you give for the generation under you of pastors and preachers and glory carriers and those who are tasked with taking on the mantle from the people of your generation. We've lost so many giants during the pandemic, and we're kind of left to pick up the pieces. But there are still some people around, such as yourself, who can impart words into the next generation. So what would that be for you?
On the natural side, if you're going to be a spiritual leader in today's society, you need a theological education and you need a secular education as well. Mm-hmm. I believe now that you will really struggle if you only have a theological education. You now need a secular education, because we are reaching the point where I see we're going to start to have more and more bivocational pastors now.
Thank you so much for all of your wisdom and your time. This was amazing. I'm going to go home and take some of these nuggets for myself.
Thank you. You drew it out of me.
Oh.
I appreciate your gift.
Thank you.
Long Island gospel sound. You know what's going down.